Imagine waking up one morning, thinking your life is perfectly normal, only to find out that everything you thought you knew was a lie. A world where trust is shattered, where your closest relationships are hiding dark secrets, and where the fight for your family's future becomes a battle for survival. Meet Brian, an ordinary father, living a peaceful life with his son, Noah. But when Brian uncovers the truth about his wife's past, he's thrust into a dangerous world of crime, betrayal, and a legacy he never saw coming. As the secrets of the past begin to unravel, Brian must face an impossible choice: protect his son and uncover the truth, or risk losing everything to a world that's darker and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. This is a story of love, betrayal, and a father's unbreakable resolve. But it's also a reminder that sometimes, the most unexpected journeys come when we least expect them. Stay with us as we dive into the twists and turns of shattered trust. You won't want to miss what happens next. Let's get started. Brian Williams, a caring and responsible high school history teacher, was used to the usual stress of his daily life. Managing classes, grading papers, and ensuring his students' success was his passion. But nothing could have prepared him for the nightmare he was about to discover. It all began when Brian picked up his 14-year-old son, Noah, from school one afternoon. As they walked home together, Noah seemed distant, his eyes filled with an emotion Brian couldn't quite place. When they reached their front door, Noah suddenly collapsed into tears. "Dad, everyone's saying I'm not your real son. Is that true?" Noah asked, his voice shaking with hurt and confusion. The words hit Brian like a sledgehammer. His world tilted as he tried to comprehend what his son had just said. He had no idea where these rumors had come from, but he suspected they were tied to something much darker. That night, after Noah had gone to bed, Brian couldn't sleep. His mind raced with questions. Had Olivia, his wife of 16 years, been hiding something from him? Could there be a secret life she was leading that he was unaware of? The thought gnawed at him, and soon, an unsettling determination took hold of him. He decided to find out the truth. The next day, Brian began his investigation. His first step was to dig into Olivia's financial records. He started by reviewing their bank statements, and soon enough, he found several suspicious transactions, large sums of money transferred to foreign accounts and unexplained payments from mysterious sources. In the midst of his discovery, Olivia came home early from work. Brian confronted her, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Olivia, what is all this? These transactions? What's going on?" Olivia's face hardened. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice cold and distant. "You wouldn't understand, Brian. I didn't want you to know this way." Brian's heart sank as Olivia confessed everything. "Noah. He's not your biological son. I had an affair years ago. And I've been involved with a criminal organization ever since. I'm sorry, but this is the life I chose." The weight of her words crashed down on him, and everything Brian had known about his life felt like a lie. His wife was not only unfaithful, but she had also been aiding a notorious criminal syndicate involved in financial fraud, blackmail, and extortion. It wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage, it was a betrayal of everything he stood for. Brian didn't know how to process the truth. The man he had been, the idealistic teacher, the loving father, was suddenly shattered. His heart was torn between his deep love for Noah and the overwhelming sense of betrayal from Olivia. As the days went by, Brian began to unravel more details. Olivia's criminal connections weren't just a passing involvement, she had been working closely with Victor DeMarco, a dangerous crime lord who ran one of the most powerful syndicates in the city. He wasn't just a man of business, he was a man of violence, known for getting rid of anyone who crossed him. Brian's next move was clear: he had to protect Noah at all costs. He couldn't let the boy become entangled in this criminal world, especially not if Olivia's associations with Victor DeMarco were as deep as they seemed. Determined to gather evidence, Brian reached out to Detective Laura Hayes, a no-nonsense investigator with a reputation for solving cases that no one else would touch. She quickly became his ally, helping him track Olivia's movements and gather evidence of her criminal activities. But as they dug deeper, they realized just how dangerous things were. Olivia wasn't the only one with secrets, there were people willing to do anything to protect the syndicate. Brian's investigation led him down dark alleys of the city, both literal and metaphorical. With Detective Hayes' help, he uncovered proof of Olivia's involvement in large-scale fraud, money laundering, and her ties to DeMarco. They even found evidence of blackmail schemes that stretched across the corporate world, involving prominent businessmen and even politicians. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Brian began receiving anonymous threats, warnings that if he didn't back off, both he and Noah would be in grave danger. Despite the fear creeping into his bones, Brian knew he couldn't stop now. He couldn't let this family destroy what was left of their lives. With Laura's help, Brian hired a private investigator named Mark, who worked in the shadows, digging into Victor DeMarco's operations. They compiled a dossier thick with damning evidence, ready to be handed over to the authorities. But they needed a public platform to make sure the story got out, no matter what. The moment of truth arrived at a high-profile charity gala held by Olivia's company. It was the perfect opportunity to expose her and DeMarco to the public, where everyone would see the woman behind the smile, the woman who had been lying to her family and the world for so long. Brian, with the help of his allies, confronted Olivia and Victor DeMarco at the gala. In front of hundreds of guests, he presented the evidence, financial records, audio recordings of conversations, and even video footage of DeMarco and Olivia meeting with other criminals. The crowd fell silent as the weight of the truth settled over the room. Olivia, her face ashen, tried to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. Within moments, police officers stormed in, arresting both her and DeMarco. The room was filled with gasps and whispers, but for Brian, it was the end of a long nightmare. He had done it. He had exposed the lies, and now justice would be served. In the aftermath of the gala, Olivia was arrested and charged with numerous crimes, including fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. The once proud woman who had betrayed her family was now facing a long prison sentence. Victor DeMarco, too, was arrested and taken down, his criminal empire collapsing in the wake of Brian's revelations. As for Brian, he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. He gained full custody of Noah, who, although hurt and confused, found comfort in his father's unwavering love. The road ahead would be long, but Brian was determined to give Noah a better life, free from the shadows of Olivia's past. Brian found a new career path, one that allowed him to use his story to help others. He became an advocate for victims of financial fraud, offering counseling and legal advice to those who had been affected by similar crimes. Slowly but surely, he rebuilt his life, and with Noah by his side, he found new hope for the future. But as the story came to a close, it was clear that Brian's journey was far from over. The scars of betrayal, while healing, would never fully disappear. And as he faced the uncertain future, he knew that no matter what came next, he would stand strong. For his son. For justice. For a future they could build together. It had been 6 months since the explosive revelations at the charity gala. Olivia was behind bars, awaiting trial, and Victor DeMarco's criminal empire had crumbled. The media attention surrounding the scandal slowly faded, but for Brian and Noah, the journey was just beginning. Brian had started a new chapter in his life, trying to navigate the delicate balance between rebuilding his career and helping Noah recover from the trauma of the past. The boy was resilient, but the whispers in school about his mother and the public shame weighed heavily on him. They moved to a new neighborhood, away from the life they had known, seeking a fresh start. It wasn't easy for Brian to leave behind the home they had shared for years, but he knew it was necessary. Every corner of the house carried painful memories of Olivia's betrayal. Now, in their new home, there was hope, a chance to heal. Brian threw himself into his work. He had found a new passion in helping victims of fraud, using his experience to make a difference. He started giving public speeches, volunteering at shelters, and advising young people about the dangers of getting involved in the wrong crowds. His journey had come full circle from the idealistic teacher he once was to a man who had faced unimaginable adversity but was determined to help others rise from it. However, despite his outward strength, Brian felt the cracks inside him. There were nights when he would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had gone wrong. He couldn't help but question his own choices, his trust in Olivia, his belief in their family. Could he have done something sooner to prevent it all from happening? Noah, too, struggled. His grades had slipped, and though he tried to put on a brave face, the isolation at school was unbearable. He had lost friends who couldn't understand the depth of what he was going through. And while he was close to Brian, the void left by his mother's actions lingered. They spent weekends together, doing simple things, hiking in the nearby mountains, watching movies, and having deep talks about life. Brian knew Noah needed more than just a father. He needed someone who would listen without judgment, someone who would guide him through the confusion of growing up under such a heavy burden. As Brian began to feel like he was making progress, an unexpected event rattled his sense of peace. A letter arrived one morning, sent from Olivia's lawyer. The letter stated that Olivia was seeking a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperating with authorities in exposing more members of the criminal syndicate. It was a tempting offer for her, and she claimed to have information that could bring down even more powerful figures within the underground world. Brian's first instinct was to ignore it. He had no desire to deal with Olivia ever again. But as time passed, curiosity gnawed at him. What could she possibly have to say? Could it help bring an end to what was left of her criminal ties? Or was it just another ploy to save herself? Against his better judgment, Brian decided to meet with Olivia. He couldn't risk the possibility of her being released back into society and causing more harm. He arranged to meet her at a neutral location, a coffee shop near the courthouse. Noah didn't want Brian to go, but Brian promised him it was for their safety, for the closure they both needed. When Brian arrived, Olivia was sitting at a corner booth, looking much older than he remembered. Her face had a worn, almost desperate expression. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place, regret, fear, or perhaps a mixture of both. "I know you didn't want to see me," Olivia said quietly as Brian sat down, "but I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know that's impossible. I just want to make things right, for Noah, for you, for everyone." Brian remained silent, his emotions a tangled mess. He could feel his pulse quickening as old anger rose within him. He was a man of principles, and everything Olivia had done violated those principles. But he wasn't here for her. He was here for Noah's future. Make things right? Brian's voice was low, controlled. How? By giving me information about your criminal friends? Or by getting a lighter sentence for yourself? Olivia's eyes lowered, but she nodded. Yes. But there's more, Brian. I have information about someone you wouldn't expect. Someone close to you. Someone who's been pulling strings from behind the scenes. The air in the room grew heavier, and Brian's heart began to race. Who? Olivia leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. Mark. The private investigator you hired. He's been feeding information to Victor's associates, working with them all along. He's the one who helped keep your son in the dark about everything, and he's been trying to manipulate the investigation. Brian froze, the shock running through his body like an electric current. Mark had been a trusted ally, someone he believed had been helping him bring justice to Olivia and DeMarco. But if Olivia was telling the truth, then everything Brian had worked for, the stability he had tried to create for Noah, was a lie. Brian's instincts told him that he couldn't trust Olivia, but the gravity of her words made him second-guess everything. He had to act fast. If Mark was indeed working with the syndicate, he was still a threat, not just to Brian and Noah, but to anyone who was trying to take down the remnants of DeMarco's criminal empire. The next day, Brian confronted Mark. They met in Brian's new office, an unassuming place, small but filled with the hope of new beginnings. Mark seemed taken aback by the confrontation, his demeanor suddenly shifting from confident to nervous. "What is this about, Brian?" Mark asked, his voice strained. "I know everything," Brian said, his gaze cold. "Olivia told me everything. You've been playing both sides. I trusted you, and you used me. You put Noah in danger. How could you do that?" Mark's face darkened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something almost sinister in his eyes. "You think I'm the only one who has been playing the game, Brian? You think you're innocent in all of this?" Brian's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Mark smirked. "You think Olivia's the only one who betrayed you? You've been naive, Williams. Everyone has their price. Even you. Don't fool yourself." Before Brian could react, Mark stood up and walked out of the room, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease. Brian felt his world shaking once again. Was Mark right? Had he, too, been compromised in ways he didn't even realize? The next few days were filled with chaos. Brian scrambled to verify the truth about Mark's involvement in the criminal syndicate. Detective Laura Hayes, who had stood by him from the beginning, was now investigating Mark in tandem. But the deeper they dug, the more complicated the situation became. Mark wasn't the only one with connections, others in Brian's inner circle had been feeding information to the wrong people. The betrayal went deeper than he ever imagined, and the danger to him and Noah escalated. It seemed that the battle for justice wasn't over, it had just begun. And now, Brian had to face a new enemy, web of lies that went far beyond Olivia's mistakes. With Noah still reeling from the fallout of the past, Brian knew one thing for sure: he would do whatever it took to protect his son, even if it meant confronting the darkest parts of his past and the people he thought he could trust. The fight for their future was only just starting, and it wasn't going to be easy. Brian couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him. Mark's words haunted him, and the implications of his betrayal were too large to ignore. Brian had trusted Mark, he had believed the man was on his side, helping him navigate the treacherous waters of exposing Olivia and Victor DeMarco's criminal empire. But now, with the revelation that Mark had been working with DeMarco's syndicate all along, Brian realized that the truth went far beyond anything he could have imagined. He sat alone in his office late at night, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His phone buzzed with a message from Detective Hayes. The tone of her message was cold and terse, almost as if she were hesitant to tell him more. "Brian, we need to meet. It's worse than we thought. Mark's not the only one. There are others. You're not the target. Noah is." The chill in Brian's spine intensified. The realization that the danger to his son was far more immediate and personal than he had anticipated hit him like a thunderclap. Noah had always been his priority, but now, he was the central figure in a tangled conspiracy that threatened everything Brian had fought to protect. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Brian met with Detective Hayes at a quiet diner. Her face was drawn, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. As soon as he sat down, she slid a manila envelope across the table toward him. "Take a look at this," she said. "It's Mark. He's been in contact with someone on the inside, someone close to you. Someone in your past. We traced the communications. It's not just a few messages. It's been going on for years." Brian opened the envelope, pulling out a series of photographs, emails, and a detailed report. The photos showed Mark meeting with a woman, someone Brian recognized instantly. It was Rachel, his former colleague from when he first started teaching, a woman who had always been friendly, supportive. Rachel had once been a close confidant. She had even been a mentor to him, offering advice when Brian was going through difficult times in his personal life. Now, the photographs showed Rachel in clandestine meetings with Mark, passing him documents, and in some shots, the unmistakable presence of men Brian didn't recognize, men with the same cold, calculating look that had belonged to DeMarco's associates. His mind raced. How could Rachel be involved? Could she have been a part of the syndicate all along, secretly working against him? Rachel, Brian muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But she's always been there for me. For Noah. I know, Detective Hayes said, her voice quiet but firm. But it's clear now. She's been working with Mark. She's deeper in this than you think. It's not just about the money, Brian. It's about control. DeMarco had a plan, and it looks like she's been part of it from the beginning. Brian felt a surge of frustration and disbelief. How many people had betrayed him? His mind spun as he tried to piece together the puzzle. Rachel had been there during the darkest moments of his life. How could she have turned on him like this? We need to confront her, Brian said, his voice hardening with resolve. I won't let Noah be a pawn in this game. Rachel agreed to meet Brian at a nearby park, one they both knew well from their time working together. She was always approachable, calm, and composed, traits that had made her seem trustworthy. But now, as Brian approached their meeting spot, he couldn't shake the sense of unease. Something in the air felt wrong. Rachel was sitting on a bench, her back turned to him as she gazed at the park's peaceful surroundings. She looked like the same woman he had known for years, dressed in a simple jacket, her hair tied back in a ponytail. But the moment she turned and saw him, the familiar warmth in her eyes had vanished. In its place was a cold calculation that sent a chill down Brian's spine. Brian, Rachel said, her voice steady. I didn't want it to come to this. But now that you know, there's no turning back. You've been lying to me, Rachel, Brian said, his voice taut with barely contained anger. All this time, you've been working with Mark. You've been working with DeMarco's people. Why? Why betray me like this? Rachel's eyes darkened. She stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. It's not personal, Brian. It never was. This is bigger than you. Bigger than your family. You think you can just take down someone like DeMarco and walk away unscathed? You've been playing the game, but you don't understand the rules. I had no choice but to follow orders. We all have a price. Brian clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. You didn't have to be involved in this. You didn't have to put Noah in danger. I trusted you. Rachel's lips curled into a tight smile. You're a good man, Brian. But good men don't win in this world. They never do. Then why even tell me? Brian shot back. If this is just about playing the game, why not just let me keep going down this path without knowing the truth? Because, Rachel said, her voice lowering, I don't want Noah to be the one who pays the price. You're too far in now. And Noah. He's the one they want. The words hung in the air like a hammer ready to fall. Brian's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Rachel hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the distance as if she were searching for the right words. They think Noah has something. Something his biological father left him. They think he holds the key to a fortune, a legacy. DeMarco's people have been looking for him for years. Brian felt the ground beneath him shift. His mind raced with confusion and fear. What are you talking about? Noah doesn't have anything. He's just a kid. Not to them, Rachel said quietly. They believe that Noah's bloodline traces back to someone who had access to assets that could make them untouchable. If they can control him, they can control everything. Brian's stomach dropped. This was no longer just about Olivia's betrayal. It was about something far more dangerous, a conspiracy that stretched back years, something that involved more than just his family. Now, it seemed that Noah wasn't just caught in the crossfire, he was the target. Brian's mind raced as he tried to piece together the information Rachel had just given him. He had to act fast. Noah was in danger, and every second counted. He needed to protect his son from whatever shadowy figures were after him. The legacy Rachel had spoken of could be a lie, but the fact that DeMarco's people were after Noah meant something darker was at play. "What do I do now, Rachel?" Brian demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "How do I protect him from this?" Rachel's face softened for a moment, but the look quickly faded. "There's only one way out of this. You need to get Noah out of the city, far away from here. You need to disappear, completely." Brian nodded, a sinking feeling in his chest. He knew Rachel was right. They couldn't stay in one place, not with DeMarco's network searching for Noah. He had to get Noah out, and fast. "I'll do whatever it takes," Brian said, his voice determined. "I'll keep him safe." Rachel nodded, her gaze hardening. "And you're going to need help. You can't do this alone." Brian's mind flickered back to Detective Hayes and the team she had assembled. She had always been on his side, and now, she was his only ally in this dangerous game. He had to trust her completely if he wanted any chance of keeping Noah safe. As he turned to leave, Rachel called after him. "Remember, Brian. DeMarco's people won't stop until they get what they want. You think this is over? It's just beginning." Brian didn't respond. His only focus now was getting Noah out of harm's way. The night was their cover. Brian's mind was sharp, but his body was running on adrenaline, every move calculated as he prepared to leave their home. His decision to go on the run with Noah wasn't one he made lightly. He knew the danger was real, and he couldn't risk waiting for things to escalate further. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. DeMarco's people had been keeping tabs on him and Noah for longer than he realized, waiting for the right moment to strike. Noah, blissfully unaware of the full scope of what was happening, packed his things quietly in the next room, his young mind struggling to understand why they were leaving so abruptly. Brian had been careful not to alarm him too much, just told him they were going to take a little trip, something that seemed normal enough to ease his anxiety. But Brian knew the truth. They weren't just going on a trip. They were fleeing for their lives. Detective Hayes had been a lifeline in this madness. After their meeting with Rachel, Brian had reached out to her immediately. He knew she had the connections to help him get Noah to safety, far away from the reach of DeMarco's people. Hayes had made arrangements for them to leave the city and hide in a remote location. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot at evading capture. When Brian and Noah left the house that night, they were careful. Brian had taken every precaution, making sure they didn't leave any trace behind. It was a clean break. They weren't looking back. Not yet. Not until they were safe. 2 days later, Brian and Noah found themselves miles away from their former life, tucked away in a secluded cabin near the woods, far from the city. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they were out of immediate danger. On the other hand, the solitude reminded Brian of how far they had fallen. The life he had worked so hard to build for Noah was in shambles, and now he had to rebuild it from the ground up. Noah was adjusting, but it wasn't easy. He missed his friends. He missed the familiarity of school and the routine they had once shared. He had questions Brian didn't have the answers to, questions about his mother, about their sudden flight, about the strange people who seemed to be after them. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" Noah asked one evening, as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Brian smiled softly, his heart heavy. "We'll be okay, buddy. I promise." But even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure. DeMarco's people were relentless, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they found Noah. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to make sense. Noah wasn't just some innocent bystander. He was the key to something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. That night, Brian lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their modest cabin. The truth was beginning to sink in. He wasn't just protecting his son from a criminal syndicate. He was protecting him from an entire underworld that believed Noah held the key to unimaginable power. Brian didn't know what that key was, but he knew it had to do with his biological father. The pieces were scattered, and every time he tried to fit them together, the picture only grew more complicated. Days turned into weeks, and Brian and Noah settled into their new routine. Brian continued to work with Detective Hayes, staying in touch over encrypted lines. She had tracked down some new leads regarding the syndicate, and every day, it seemed like they were getting closer to uncovering the truth. But the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Brian's suspicions about Noah's connection to the criminal world had deepened. He started digging into the past, trying to find any trace of information about Noah's biological father. So far, he had found little, just a name and a few vague references to someone who had been involved in business dealings with DeMarco long before the scandal had started. But when Brian pressed harder, he uncovered something even more startling. It wasn't just that Noah's biological father was connected to DeMarco. It was that he had once been an integral part of the syndicate himself. A high-ranking member, someone who had been killed under mysterious circumstances years ago. That left a terrifying possibility: was Noah the heir to this empire? Brian's heart sank as the implications of his findings settled in. If Noah was truly the heir, that would mean the syndicate would stop at nothing to get him. And if they thought they could control him, they would try to bend him to their will. Brian couldn't allow that to happen. His son was just a child, he was not a pawn in their game. Brian had to find a way to protect him from a world he shouldn't have to understand, let alone be a part of. As the weeks wore on, the tension in the air grew thicker. Brian received a message one afternoon, this time from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, knowing that any communication could be a trap. But he had no choice. He had to know what was going on. "We know where you are. We always do. Don't think you can run forever. You can't hide from your past. Noah belongs with us. Come to the old warehouse by the docks tonight at midnight. Alone. If you want to keep him safe, you'll listen." The message was clear, and the implications were terrifying. DeMarco's people had found them. But what did they want? Why were they contacting Brian directly now? What were they after? He showed the message to Noah, whose face paled as he read it. Brian didn't want to frighten him further, but he knew the time for hiding was over. He had to face whatever lay ahead, and he had to do it on his terms. "Stay here, Noah," Brian said quietly. "Lock the door behind me. Don't come out, no matter what." Noah looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad, what's going to happen?" "I don't know yet, buddy," Brian said softly. "But I'll protect you. I always will." Brian left the cabin under the cover of darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know who he was about to face, but he knew one thing for sure: no matter what, he would not let anyone take Noah from him. The warehouse was as cold and desolate as Brian had imagined it. He stood in the shadows, watching as two figures approached, their movements deliberate and calm. Brian tensed, instinctively preparing for whatever confrontation awaited him. The first man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the shadows. The second man was older, his gray hair combed neatly, his expression unreadable. They were both dangerous, that much was clear. "Brian Williams," the tall man said, his voice low and smooth. "You've been hard to track down, but you can't run forever. You and your son are tied to something much bigger than you understand." Brian's pulse quickened. "What do you want with Noah?" The older man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We don't want him. We want you. You see, Brian, Noah is the key to something that's been hidden for a long time. And you're standing in the way." Brian's mind raced. What did they mean by this? What was Noah involved in? The more they spoke, the clearer it became: this was about more than just money, more than just power. This was about legacy, about secrets from the past that had been buried for too long. "Leave my son out of this," Brian growled, stepping forward. "Whatever you're after, you'll have to go through me." The tall man smiled coldly. "That's exactly what we were hoping for." The confrontation in the warehouse had shaken Brian to his core. The men who had approached him were no ordinary criminals. They were part of something much larger, a network tied to powerful people in the underworld who had their eyes fixed on Noah. The tall man's chilling words echoed in Brian's mind, "You're standing in the way." Brian was no longer sure what was real or what he could trust. The life he'd built for Noah, his careful, protective existence, was crumbling around him. Every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into a web of lies and danger. The only thing that kept him going was the thought of his son's safety. He had to find a way to stop them, no matter the cost. That night, he returned to the cabin, his mind racing with the realization that things were far worse than he had imagined. Noah was still inside, waiting for him, and Brian knew he had to be honest with him. But how could he explain a battle that Noah couldn't possibly understand? How could he shield his son from the crushing weight of the world that was closing in on them? Noah was sitting by the window, his face pale. When Brian stepped inside, he stood up immediately, his eyes wide with concern. "Dad, what happened? Who were they?" Noah asked, his voice shaking. Brian swallowed hard. "I don't know yet, buddy. But I promise you, we'll be okay. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." But even as he spoke those words, Brian knew they were running out of time. The men in the warehouse weren't the only ones looking for them. The network that had been keeping tabs on Noah for years had no intention of letting him go. And soon, Brian would have to make a choice, one that could change everything. As the days went by, Brian and Noah kept their heads down, staying as low as possible. Detective Hayes had been their only lifeline, but even she was running out of options. The pressure on them was mounting, and every time Brian checked in with her, he heard the same thing: "We're doing everything we can. But it's not enough." In an effort to gather more information, Brian decided to take a risk. He reached out to someone he never thought he would, Mark. After everything that had happened, Brian had never imagined he'd have to rely on Mark again. The man who had once been his closest confidant had betrayed him in the worst possible way. But Mark was tied to DeMarco's syndicate, and if there was anyone who knew how to navigate the criminal underworld, it was him. Brian arranged a meeting with Mark at a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, far from the eyes of anyone who might be watching. The meeting was tense, the air thick with distrust. Mark had agreed to help, but Brian didn't know if he could truly trust him. Mark stepped out from the shadows, his face grim. "You're still alive, I see. I didn't expect that." Brian's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here for your games, Mark. I need answers. What the hell is going on with Noah?" Mark looked around cautiously before speaking. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Brian. DeMarco's people, they're not just after money. They're after control. Control of a legacy that Noah doesn't even know he's part of." Brian's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What legacy?" Mark took a deep breath, looking pained. Noah's biological father wasn't just some random guy. He was a key player in DeMarco's organization. And Noah. He's his son. That means he's more than just a kid. He's the heir to a massive fortune. A fortune that DeMarco's people believe will give them untouchable power. Brian's mind reeled with the implications. "But I thought Noah's father was dead. How could this be true?" "That's the thing," Mark said, lowering his voice. "Noah's father faked his death. And now that he's gone, DeMarco wants his son to take his place. They think Noah has the key to something that will solidify their hold on everything. If they can control him, they'll control everything." Brian could barely process what Mark was saying. It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Where is he now?" Brian asked urgently. How do we stop them? Mark hesitated before answering. There's only one way to get ahead of them. You need to go to the vault. The vault? Brian repeated, confused. It's an old safe house, hidden away. It's where your son's father kept the key to the fortune. The thing DeMarco's people are after. But be careful, Brian. It's not just about finding the key. It's about surviving long enough to use it. Brian's heart was pounding in his chest. He had no choice but to follow through. He had to protect Noah, no matter what it took. Mark gave Brian detailed instructions on how to find the vault. It was located in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, a place that had long been forgotten by most. The journey was dangerous. Brian could feel the weight of every step, knowing that DeMarco's people were likely watching their every move. But there was no turning back now. Noah stayed behind at the cabin, reluctantly agreeing to stay out of harm's way. Brian knew it was the best decision, but it didn't make the separation any easier. He promised his son he'd be back soon. The building that housed the vault was an old, crumbling structure. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of decay. Brian had never been to this part of the city, but something about the place felt off, like it had been forgotten for a reason. He made his way through the darkened corridors, following Mark's directions. After what felt like hours, Brian found himself standing in front of a reinforced steel door. He took a deep breath, his heart racing, and then he stepped forward, turning the cold, rusted handle. Inside the vault, everything was as Mark had described, a series of boxes, locked and hidden away. Brian knew this was it, the key to ending the nightmare. But as he stepped forward to open the nearest box, the door behind him creaked open, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The figures that appeared in the doorway weren't just any criminals, they were DeMarco's men. They had found him. Thought you could hide forever, the leader of the group said, his voice dripping with malice. You're too late, Brian. This is ours now. Brian's pulse quickened, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let them have Noah, not now, not ever. In a flash, he grabbed the nearest box and made a run for it. The men pursued him, but Brian was determined. He would protect his son, no matter what. The chase was on. Brian raced through the dark, unfamiliar corridors of the building, clutching the box tightly in his hands. He could hear the heavy footsteps of DeMarco's men behind him, getting closer with every passing second. He wasn't going to make it. Just as Brian reached the exit, a loud crash echoed through the building. A figure stepped into his path. It was Mark. You shouldn't have trusted me, Mark said, his voice cold. But you had to know, didn't you? I was always going to be a part of this. Brian's heart sank. Mark had betrayed him again. There was no escaping it now. Give me the box, Brian, Mark ordered, his eyes cold and calculating. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Brian stood his ground, his hand tightening around the box. I won't let you do this. As the tension in the air thickened, Brian realized that the fight for Noah's future was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Mark's betrayal hit Brian like a punch to the gut. He'd always known there was something off about Mark, but to find out he'd been working with DeMarco's syndicate all along was something else entirely. The box in Brian's hand, the supposed key to ending this nightmare, suddenly felt heavy with the weight of its secrets. You don't understand, Brian said, his voice low but steady. This isn't about money or power. This is about my son. I won't let you take him. Mark's lips curled into a cruel smile. You're not in control here, Brian. You never were. You were just a pawn in this game. All that's left now is to give up and hand over what you found. It's not too late to make this easy. Brian felt a surge of anger. His son's future was at stake, his legacy, his safety, everything they had fought for. And no matter how many times Mark had betrayed him, Brian wasn't about to let him win. "I've already made my choice," Brian replied, his grip tightening on the box. "And I'm not giving up. Not now. Not ever." In that moment, the door to the warehouse crashed open, and two more figures appeared, DeMarco's men, guns drawn, their eyes fixed on Brian. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls constricting, trapping him in the final moment of decision. "I don't have time for this," Brian muttered under his breath. There was no easy escape, no turning back now. He had to act. He had to protect Noah. But as the men moved closer, Brian knew the odds were stacked against him. He couldn't win this fight by force alone. It was a gamble, an impossible one, but one he had to take. He took a deep breath, pivoted on his heel, and sprinted toward the exit. Brian's heart hammered in his chest as he ran through the corridors of the building, the sound of footsteps pounding behind him. He could hear the men shouting orders, their voices echoing off the walls. It was clear they were closing in on him. But Brian was determined. He wasn't just running for his life, he was running for Noah. The thought of what DeMarco and his men could do to his son if they got their hands on him made every breath he took feel like fire. He burst through the front door of the warehouse and into the night air, the cool breeze a sharp contrast to the chaos in his mind. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape route, but it was no use. DeMarco's men were already there, blocking off every possible exit. The time for running was over. Brian had one last card to play. In a moment of desperation, he threw the box high into the air, watching as it landed on the ground several feet away from him. The men hesitated for a split second, drawn to the mysterious object. Brian used that moment to make his move. He lunged toward the box, grabbing it just as one of the men reached out to stop him. The sharp click of a gun's safety being released rang in his ears, but Brian didn't hesitate. He slammed the box closed with a force that sent a shockwave through his body, the contents inside shifting. That's when he heard the shout. "Noah!" Brian's heart lurched as he turned to see his son standing at the edge of the warehouse, eyes wide with fear and confusion. The men saw him too, their eyes narrowing with malicious intent. "Noah, get back!" Brian shouted, rushing toward his son. But it was too late. DeMarco's men were already moving in, their intentions clear. The fight was about to escalate, and Brian knew he didn't have much time. Without thinking, Brian reached into the box he held and pulled out what appeared to be a small, old-fashioned key. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like everything. It was the only thing that could give him the upper hand. He raced toward Noah, gripping the key tightly. "Get behind me," he yelled. But Noah, despite his fear, didn't hesitate. He ran to his father, who was now standing between him and the approaching men. Brian could see the terror in his eyes, but also something else, something that reminded him of his own resolve. "Noah, listen to me," Brian said, his voice calm but firm. "You need to trust me. Whatever happens, I'll protect you." Noah nodded, his small hand gripping Brian's arm. It was a promise. A promise that Brian was willing to give everything to keep. The men stopped just a few feet away, their guns aimed at Brian. The leader stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You really think you can stop this, Brian?" he sneered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Brian didn't flinch. He stood tall, blocking Noah from view, ready to make his stand. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," he said, his voice steady. "And I'll do whatever it takes to protect him." The standoff was tense. The silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Brian could feel the weight of the moment, the heavy weight of his decisions, of the life he had fought to build for Noah, hanging in the balance. And then, just as the leader of DeMarco's men raised his gun, a deafening shot rang out. Brian didn't know who had fired first, but it didn't matter. The warehouse was thrown into chaos as the sound of gunfire echoed through the building. Mark, who had been standing in the background, stepped forward, his gun raised. I couldn't let them have him either, he said, his voice almost apologetic. You were right all along. Noah's not the enemy. Brian's heart skipped a beat as he processed what Mark had just said. What do you mean? DeMarco doesn't know the whole story, Mark replied, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and guilt. Noah's father faked his death because he wanted out. The syndicate was after him too, and he couldn't let them get their hands on Noah. That's why he left. But DeMarco, he wants to finish what he started. Brian's mind raced as the truth began to sink in. Noah's biological father hadn't just been a criminal, he had been trying to protect his son from the same fate that had nearly destroyed him. And DeMarco's men weren't after power, they were after a legacy that Noah didn't even know existed. Noah's not a pawn, Brian said, his voice filled with resolve. He's not your ticket to power. He's my son. And I won't let anyone take him from me. The gunfire stopped. The leader of DeMarco's men was lying motionless on the floor, and the rest of his crew had either fled or were being held at gunpoint by Mark. The battle was over, for now. The aftermath of the fight left Brian and Noah shaken but safe. Mark, though still a dangerous ally, had helped them escape the worst of the storm. DeMarco's syndicate had suffered a significant blow, but it wasn't the end of the war. The truth about Noah's heritage had been revealed, and there was no going back. But for the first time in a long time, Brian felt a sense of peace. His son was safe. He had kept his promise. With the key now in their possession, Brian and Noah were ready to move forward. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead was uncertain. But they had each other, and that was enough. Together, they left the city behind, disappearing into a new life where they could start fresh, free from the shadows of the past. And as they drove away, Brian glanced at Noah, who was quietly looking out the window, his eyes reflecting the promise of a new beginning. We're going to be okay, Brian whispered, his voice filled with certainty. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. Wow, what a journey. We've seen Brian's courage tested to the limit, as he fought not only to uncover the truth but to protect his son from a world of darkness he never expected to face. But even with the truth revealed, the fight for their future is far from over. So, what's next for Brian and Noah? How do they rebuild after everything they've lost? Only time will tell. But I want to hear from you. What do you think will happen next? Do you think Brian and Noah will find peace, or is this just the beginning of even more challenges? Drop your thoughts and predictions in the comments below, I'd love to know what you think. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more thrilling tales like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you want to share your thoughts on the characters, the plot twists, or anything else, I'm always reading your comments, so make sure to leave one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay safe, and remember, trust is everything.